In 9 years, Social Security's reserves hit zero. Here's which mechanism guarantees you'll pay full taxes but receive partial benefits. There are 5 mechanisms controlling this wealth transfer, and you're funding Mechanism 2 right now. The 2024 Trustees Report sits on a boardroom table in Baltimore. Page 3 shows the depletion date, 2033. Page 16 shows the automatic cut, 23% of promised benefits. The document is public. 80 million millennials scroll past it on their phones. The trust fund holds $2.8 trillion, but it's not cash. It's Treasury IOUs. When reserves exhaust, there's no vault to open. The government owes itself money, and you're the creditor and debtor simultaneously. The question isn't if benefits get cut, it's whether anyone notices the vendor financing structure before their first payment arrives 30% smaller than promised. This is Mechanism 1. Here's why this matters to you. Every paycheck, 12.4% disappears into FICA. So that's $6,200 annually on a $50,000 salary when you include the employer match. You've been told this buys your retirement. The demographic trap says you're mathematically guaranteed to lose money. The boardroom metric is the worker-to-retiree ratio. In 1950, 16 workers supported 1 retiree. The early beneficiaries contributed pennies and collected dollars. That wasn't fraud, it was demographic leverage. By 2023, the ratio collapsed to 3.3 workers per retiree. In 2035, it hits 2.3 to 1. That's not a projection. That's people already born, already aging, already in the pipeline. Picture the Social Security Administration actuaries in Baltimore running the 2024 model. They input current workforce size, birth rates, life expectancy tables. The model doesn't care about intent or fairness, it calculates cash flow coverage. The output is mechanical. At 2.3 to 1, incoming FICA revenue funds 77% of promised obligations. The 23% gap isn't a policy choice. It's arithmetic. Here's how it works. The tool is forced lending, what the boardroom calls vendor financing. Every worker pays into the system with zero optionality. The contract logic is simple. Current workers fund current retirees. You're not saving, you're underwriting someone else's retirement, while hoping the next cohort underwrites yours. Congress sets a payroll tax rate, currently 12.4%, applies it to wages up to a cap of $168,600 in 2024, and deposits the revenue into the trust fund. Benefits flow out immediately. When inflows exceed outflows, the surplus gets invested. But we'll examine that mirage in Mechanism 2. The ratio determines everything. At 16 to 1, the system could promise generous benefits because the contribution base was massive relative to obligations. At 3.3 to 1, the math tightens. At 2.3 to 1, it breaks. This isn't a funding crisis that might happen. It's a contractual collapse already baked into birth certificates and actuarial tables. Let me be completely clear about what this means for you. If you're 35 years old, you'll contribute roughly $270,000 over your working life in inflation-adjusted terms, including the employer portion. At a 2.3 to 1 ratio, you'll receive approximately $215,000 in benefits. That's a 20% loss before we account for benefit cuts, means testing or retirement age increases. Your parents' generation contributed $100,000 and collected $150,000. The leverage worked for them. It won't for you. The ratio collapse creates a new incentive structure for younger workers, distrust. When the math guarantees negative returns, rational actors seek alternatives. That's driving the explosion in private retirement accounts. 401k contributions are up. IRA rollovers accelerating, because workers smell the trap. But here's the problem. You can't opt out of FICA. You're funding current retirees regardless of whether you build parallel savings. You might be thinking immigration solves the ratio problem. Bring in more workers, restore the demographic leverage. Here's the problem with that assumption. Immigration adds both workers and future retirees. The workers contribute now, but they'll collect later. Unless immigration surges permanently at replacement level rates of 2.1 children per woman or higher, you're just delaying the math. And U.S. birth rates sit at 1.6. The developed world can't breed its way out of unfunded pension obligations. France tried, Japan tried, the ratio always wins. France 1945 had a pension system supporting 4 million retirees, with 20 million workers, a 5-to-1 ratio that made benefits generous and sustainable. By 2020, the ratio inverted to 1.7 to 1, forcing the parametric restructuring that Americans are now watching from 9 years out. And that's just mechanism 1, the demographic trap that makes losses inevitable. Mechanism 2 explains where your contributions actually go the moment they're collected. This is mechanism 2. Here's why this matters to you. You've been told Social Security has a trust fund worth $2.8 trillion. That sounds like a reserve, like savings, like there's money set aside for your retirement. The vendor financing mirage says there's no vault, no cash, no assets. There are treasury securities, entree government IOUs, promising to pay you back using future taxes. On you. The boardroom term is vendor financing, forced lending. When you buy something and the seller immediately lends you the money to pay for it, that's not a transaction. That's a circular cash flow. The Social Security system collects FICA, immediately pays current retirees, and invests any surplus in treasury bonds. The government spends that cash on defense, Medicare, debt service, whatever the budget needs. What's left in the trust fund is a legal claim on future tax revenue. Picture the Treasury Department receiving FICA deposits. The money hits the Social Security Trust Fund account. Benefits go out immediately, $1.4 trillion annually to 67 million retirees. Any surplus gets credited to the trust fund as special issue Treasury securities. These bonds cannot be traded, cannot be sold to third parties, cannot be converted to cash except by taxing future workers. The asset on Social Security's books is a liability on the Treasury's books. The federal government owes money to itself. When the trust fund redeems bonds to pay your benefits in 2040, the Treasury must either raise taxes, cut spending, or issue new debt. You're simultaneously the creditor and the debtor. Here's how it actually works. The tool is the mandatory investment restriction. By law, the trust fund can only hold Treasury securities. It cannot buy stocks, real estate, corporate bonds, or any asset that might generate real returns. The stated reason is safety. Treasuries are risk-free. The actual effect is that Social Security becomes a captive lender to the federal government. This creates a beautiful financing loop for Congress. FICA revenue comes in automatically, you can't opt out. The surplus gets saved in treasuries, mandatory investment. The Treasury spends the cash immediately, funds the deficit. The debt gets added to the national balance sheet, hidden obligation. When benefits exceed revenue, the trust fund redeems bonds, and the Treasury must find new cash by taxing your kids. Let's say you contribute $6,000 this year. That money goes into the trust fund. $5,500 goes straight out the door to pay current retirees. The $500 surplus gets credited as a Treasury bond earning 2.3% interest. But the cash is gone, spent on aircraft carriers or highway funding, or interest on existing debt. The interest you're earning is just another IOU. When you retire, the system redeems the bond and the government taxes someone else to pay you. Now we have to address the elephant in the room. What this means for you, the $2.8 trillion reserve is not money. It's a bookkeeping entry representing how much future taxpayers owe you. If the federal government faces a fiscal crisis in 2035 and tax revenue collapses and they can't roll the debt, your Social Security benefits get paid with what? Printed money, haircut benefits. The trust fund offers zero protection because it holds zero external assets. You own a claim on a government that's already $35 trillion in debt. This vendor financing structure creates a hidden transfer. Your FICA contributions suppress Treasury yields. If Social Security could invest in private markets, the Treasury would need to find other buyers for $2.8 trillion in bonds. That would push yields higher, increasing the government's borrowing costs. So the current structure subsidizes federal spending by forcing Social Security into low-yield government debt. You're not just funding retirees, you're subsidizing the deficit. You might be thinking, Treasuries are the safest asset. The U.S. has never defaulted. Here's the problem with that assumption. You're conflating nominal safety with real returns. Yes, Treasuries won't default in dollar terms, but they can default in purchasing power. If inflation runs at 4% and the trust fund earns 2.3%, that's a real loss every year. The government pays you back in devalued dollars. That's not safety, that's slow-motion haircut. And when the trust fund depletes in 2033, the safety of those bonds becomes irrelevant because there won't be any left to redeem. Britain 1945 held sterling balances of £3.5 billion in reserves, any representing forced savings from colonies and trading partners who believed they owned liquid wealth. They didn't discover until the 1949 devaluation that their reserves had lost 30% purchasing power in a weekend because Britain spent the cash immediately and left I owe us. That's the vendor financing mirage, reserves that exist on paper but not in vaults. Mechanism 3 explains what happens when those paper reserves finally run dry. This is Mechanism 3. Here's why this matters to you. Right now, in 2024, Social Security is spending more than it collects. The trust fund is being drawn down every single year. In 2033, the reserves hit zero. That's not a maybe. That's the Social Security Administration's official projection. When depletion arrives, benefits get cut automatically by 23%, unless Congress intervenes. That's $460 per month lost on a $2,000 benefit. The boardroom calls this a depletion event, the moment when reserves exhaust and incoming cash flow can't cover obligations. It's a restructuring trigger built into the system by law. The Social Security Act specifies that if the trust fund balance falls to zero, benefits must be reduced to match available revenue. No vote required, no debate. Automatic haircut. Picture the actuaries updating their model every year. They track three numbers: total reserves, annual revenue, annual benefits. In 2021, the crossover happened. For the first time since 1982, Social Security paid out more than it collected. The reserves started declining. Every year since, the gap widens. By 2033, the math says reserves hit zero. Here's how it works. The trigger is cash flow coverage. As long as the trust fund has a positive balance, Social Security pays 100% of scheduled benefits. The instant reserves deplete, the system can only pay what comes in through FICA taxes. On our current projections show incoming revenue will cover 77% of obligations. The 23% shortfall is automatic, mechanical, unavoidable without legislative action. The timeline is faster than anyone wants to admit. We're 9 years out. That's closer than the 2008 financial crisis is to today. If you're 50 years old, planning to retire at 67, you'll hit retirement age in 2041. The depletion event happens 8 years before you collect your first check. If you're 35, you're 28 years from retirement. You'll spend your entire peak earning years contributing to a system that will be depleted for 15 years before you're eligible for benefits. Let me be completely clear about the math. In 2033, Social Security will collect approximately $1.35 trillion in FICA revenue. It will owe approximately $1.75 trillion in benefits. The $400 billion gap is the difference between what's promised and what's funded. That gap is $180,000 per household if spread across all taxpayers. Congress must either cut benefits, raise taxes, or inject general revenue. There is no fourth option. So what does this actually mean for your retirement planning? If you're expecting $30,000 per year in Social Security benefits and you retire post-depletion, you're actually getting $23,100. Can you survive retirement on 23% less income with no notice? Most households can't. The median retirement savings for Americans aged 55 to 64 is $185,000. That's enough to generate maybe $7,000 per year safely. If Social Security drops from $30,000 to $23,000, you're covering a $7,000 annual gap for potentially 20 years. Your savings are gone in a decade. The depletion event creates a new risk for every worker under 50. Covenant breach. You paid into a system that promised specific benefits. The moment reserves exhaust, that promise gets modified unilaterally. You have no recourse, no opt-out, no alternative. The Supreme Court ruled in 1960 in Fleming v. Nestor that Social Security benefits are not contractual rights. Congress can change the terms at any time, but here's the problem. The political system won't fix this preemptively. Fixing it requires either disappointing current retirees with benefit cuts or angering current workers with tax increases, and neither option is politically viable until crisis forces action. That's why every proposal to reform Social Security dies in committee. The incentive is to delay until reserves deplete, then blame the math. You might be thinking, Congress will act before 2033. They always do. Here's the problem with that assumption. They haven't yet. The 2024 Trustees Report has been public for months. The depletion date has been known since the 1990s, when it was projected for the 2030s. Congress has had 30 years to adjust the math. They've done nothing. The French government delayed pension reform for decades, despite knowing the ratio was collapsing. When they finally acted in 2023, raising the retirement age from 62 to 64, millions protested. The reforms passed anyway. The math always wins. And here's where it gets worse. The longer Congress waits, the more painful the fix. If they had acted in 2010, a modest 1 percentage point payroll tax increase would have closed the gap. Now by 2024, it requires a 3 percentage point increase, or a 21% benefit cut, or raising the retirement age to 69. By 2033, when reserves are gone, the options are even more extreme. Delay makes the eventual restructuring catastrophic. Greece 2010 faced a similar depletion event when bond markets refused to refinance their debt. They had promised pension benefits they couldn't fund. The result was a 40% cut to retirees imposed by the IMF as a condition for rescue loans. Or if the Greek government had no choice, the money wasn't there. American Social Security is heading toward the same cliff, just on a slower timeline. That's the depletion event, the moment when promises exceed funding and the automatic haircut begins. Mechanism 4 reveals which restructuring options Congress will choose when the crisis arrives. This is Mechanism 4. Here's why this matters to you. When the trust fund depletes, Congress faces 3 options. Raise payroll taxes, cut benefits. 8. Increase the retirement age. Every option transfers costs to you. None of the fixes restore what you were promised. The boardroom calls this the restructuring menu, the covenant modifications available to restore solvency. The Social Security trustees model each scenario every year. They publish the exact numbers required to close the funding gap. The 2024 report shows the math. A 3.3 percentage point payroll tax increase, or a 21% benefit cut, or raising the full retirement age to 69. Now, pick your pain. Picture the Congressional Budget Office running simulations. They test combinations, smaller tax increases paired with smaller benefit cuts, phased over decades to reduce voter backlash. Every scenario involves wealth transfer from workers to retirees, or from future beneficiaries to current ones. There is no scenario where everyone gets what they were promised. Here's how it works. The tool is a legislative covenant authority. Congress controls the payroll tax rate, the benefit formula, the retirement age, the COLA calculation. They can modify any of these variables to close the funding gap. The question isn't whether they'll act, it's which lever they pull and who bears the cost. Option 1. Raise the payroll tax from 12.4% to 15.7%. That's an extra 3.3 percentage points. On a $50,000 salary, that's $1,650 per year more in FUCA taxes, split between you and your employer. But the employer portion suppresses your wages, so you effectively pay both halves. Total cost, $1,650 annually for your entire working life. Over 40 years, that's $66,000 in additional contributions to fund someone else's retirement. Option 2. Cut benefits by 21% across the board. If you're expecting $2,000 per month, you get $1,580. Over a 20-year retirement, that's $100,800 in lost income. And this is the optimistic scenario where the cut is applied equally. More likely, Congress uses means testing, cutting benefits for anyone with retirement savings or income above a threshold. If you saved responsibly, you get penalized. Option 3. Raise the full retirement age from 67 to 69. That's 2 additional years of work before you're eligible for full benefits. If you're making $50,000 per year, that's $100,000 in foregone retirement income over 2 years. Plus 2 more years of payroll taxes. $6,200 times 2 equals $12,400. A total cost, $112,400. Bottom line, every restructuring option costs you between $66,000 and $112,000. And these are conservative estimates assuming Congress acts immediately. The longer they delay, the more extreme the fixes become. If they wait until 2033, the required tax increase jumps to 4 percentage points, or the benefit cut to 25%. Now we have to address the elephant in the room. Why hasn't Congress fixed this already? Because the voting demographics protect current beneficiaries. Voters aged 65 and older have turnout rates 25 percentage points higher than voters under 30. They're 27% of the electorate, but cast 30% of votes. Any politician who proposes benefit cuts loses their seat. Any politician who proposes tax increases on workers faces opposition from the business lobby. The path of least resistance is delay. The restructuring menu creates perverse incentives. Current retirees want to extract maximum benefits before depletion. Workers want to minimize contributions. Future retirees get stuck in the middle, paying full taxes but receiving partial benefits. This isn't a coordination problem that can be solved with better communication. It's a wealth transfer mechanism where timing determines who wins. You might be thinking, what if they just eliminate the payroll tax cap? Currently, earnings above $168,600 don't get taxed for Social Security. And if they tax all income, that closes part of the gap. Here's the problem with that assumption. Eliminating the cap only closes 73% of the funding shortfall. You'd still need benefit cuts or retirement age increases, and high earners would respond by restructuring compensation into non-wage income, dividends, capital gains, anything to avoid the tax. The Congressional Budget Office models this every year. Eliminating the cap helps, but it's not enough. And here's where it gets worse. The restructuring options aren't mutually exclusive. Congress will likely combine them. A 1.5 percentage point tax increase, plus a 10% benefit cut, plus raising retirement age to 68. You pay more, work longer, and get less. That's the politically viable path because it spreads the pain across multiple groups. France implemented exactly this combination between 2010 and 2023. They raised the retirement age from 60 to 64, increased contribution periods from 150 quarters to 172 quarters, and shifted the benefit calculation from best 10 years to best 25 years, cutting payouts 15 to 20%. Millions protested. The reforms passed. The alternative was insolvency. That's the restructuring menu, the covenant modifications that transfer costs to you. Mechanism 5 reveals why political paralysis guarantees maximum pain. This is Mechanism 5. Here's why this matters to you. The system won't be fixed until it's too late. Political incentives guarantee that reforms are delayed until reserves deplete, maximizing pain for workers still decades from retirement. You're not dealing with a technical problem. You're dealing with a political covenant that protects current beneficiaries at your expense. The boardroom metric is voting power. Voters aged 65 and older make up 27% of the electorate, but cast 30 to 35% of ballots due to higher turnout. They're organized, they're consistent, and they vote their economic interests. Any politician who threatens current benefits loses re-election. That's why Social Security is called the third rail of American politics. Touch it, and you die. Picture a House Ways and Means Committee hearing on Social Security reform. The room is full of AARP representatives, union officials, retiree advocacy groups. They testify that benefit cuts are unacceptable. The committee chair nods, promises to protect current beneficiaries, and tables the legislation. This happens every session. The political cost of reform exceeds the political cost of delay until crisis eliminates the choice. Here's how it works. The tool is political capture through demographic leverage. Current retirees and near retirees, roughly 75 million people, have an intense, concentrated interest in preserving benefits. Workers under 40, roughly 80 million people, have a diffuse, future interest in fixing the system. Of concentrated interests beat diffuse interest in democratic politics. The 75 million win. If you understand nothing else, understand this. The depletion event arriving in 2033 is not an accident. It's the result of 30 years of deliberate delay. The 1983 reforms were supposed to make Social Security solvent for 75 years. They assumed demographic growth that never materialized. By the 1990s, actuaries knew the system would face insolvency in the 2030s. Congress did nothing. By the 2000s, the timeline firmed up, depletion around 2033 to 2035. Congress did nothing. By 2024, we're 9 years out. Congress is still doing nothing. The political stalemate creates a guarantee. Reforms will be crisis-driven, not proactive. When reserves hit zero, Congress will be forced to act immediately. They'll have weeks, not years, to negotiate. The resulting legislation will be whatever can pass quickly, which means maximum pain distributed across the politically weakest groups, workers under 50. I'll say who don't vote in high numbers will absorb most of the cost. So what does this actually mean? It means you cannot rely on Congress to fix Social Security before you retire. You must plan for partial benefits. If you're 35, assume you'll receive 70 to 75% of promised amounts. If you're 50, assume 80 to 85%. Adjust your retirement savings accordingly. That's the rational response to political risk. But here's the problem. Most workers aren't adjusting. They see Social Security statements promising specific benefits and assume the government will deliver. They're planning retirements based on full benefits. When the haircut arrives, millions of households will face a choice: work longer or live on less. They won't have time to rebuild savings. The damage is permanent. You might be thinking, younger voters will eventually outnumber retirees and force reform. Here's the problem with that assumption. By the time younger voters gain voting power, the system will already be depleted. The 2033 depletion date arrives before millennials, the largest generational cohort, become the dominant voting bloc. And even when they do, they'll face the same dilemma: cut their own future benefits or raise taxes on their kids. The political stalemate just shifts forward in time. The French pension crisis illustrates this perfectly. Protesters in 2023 were demanding the government reverse the retirement age increase from 62 to 64. But the math was clear. France's pension system was running deficits of 12 billion euros annually. Without reform, insolvency was certain. The government pushed through reforms despite mass strikes. Political will only materialized when crisis left no alternative. That's the political stalemate, the governance failure that guarantees crisis-driven restructuring. Those are the 5 mechanisms. Here's why they won't break. Same room in Baltimore, same trustees report, different numbers. The reserve balance declines every year. The depletion date holds steady. 2033. 9 years becomes 8 becomes 7. The mechanisms don't change. The demographic trap compounds. The vendor financing continues. The political stalemate persists. The question was never whether benefits would be cut. It was whether anyone would notice the 5 mechanisms had already locked in the outcome before they started paying attention.